So before we started recording, I was telling Lisa that it's number one, a pleasure, because I've been a long time nerdy Jungian fan of the podcast. I devour it constantly. And I'm always sending today, you have to listen to this episode. You have to listen to this episode. But also, it's such a treat to have a fellow podcaster who we don't have to coach through audio and lighting. It's the little things that make our lives easier.
Totally understand that.
But we're so glad to have you. Seriously, like in all seriousness, I'm a major fan. And I think what the three of you bring through your podcast is so helpful. I know because Danae and I did something similar with ours. It really was just three friends and colleagues wanting to have these conversations and, hey, let's hit record. That's exactly how ours started.
Wow, that's great.
And then not realizing how much impact you're actually going to have, right? I mean, you guys have really gotten a successful pod going, and it's niche still, and it's impressive. So I'm really grateful to have you here.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah.
It's lovely to meet you guys.
You too. So we usually start off with all of our guests because we're curious kind of how it all began. So Lisa, take us back. Like, how did you get to be who you are, right? You've got a couple books under your belt. You've got the podcast. You're an analyst. But I also know, kind of poking around in my research, that that's not necessarily what you first went to school to do, right? So, like, how did you get to be who you are?
So you want the long story?
Give it to us. Give it to us.
So I majored in medieval European history at college. So very practical, very career-oriented major. And I wound up, when I graduated from college, I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I was really gripped by the idea of working in international humanitarian assistance. And I sort of felt like, there are probably things going on in the world that I don't know about that are really terrible. Maybe I could make a difference. So I worked my way into that field. I kind of, started off as an unpaid intern in Washington and kind of worked my way up and had a substantive role. And it was great. I loved that work, and it was really meaningful for a while. And then when I was in my late 20s, I made a shift. I was like, well, I'm going to do this more seriously. I wanted to get a law degree, work, bring a human rights angle to it, and get a nonprofit management degree. So I was at Columbia doing both of those things, and I just sort of had a night's a dark night of the soul. I just was 28, which I subsequently learned is a significant year.
Saturn return.
Saturn return, and I was like, oh my God, I just, I sort of had this collapse. And what kind of triggered it was this guy that I was dating broke up with me. And I think it was, that is deep, right? A lot of people have that experience where that really kind of moves the ground underneath your feet. But I think it wasn't just that. I think I also had this deeper feeling of like, this is not what I'm actually supposed to be doing. So the story that I have told repeatedly, and it's, it's a darn good story, is I'm in graduate school at Columbia. I'm getting a master's in international affairs. And I'm living on the Upper West Side. And I am sort of fighting back depression that whole year. But then I wake up this one morning in March and I just have like a pit in my stomach, like a sort of an oh fuck feeling. And I was like, all right, what am I going to do to make sure I have an okay day? So I tried all the things. I went and had coffee at my favorite coffee shop around the corner. I called every person I knew. I was like, hey, do you want to hang out today? Nobody was available. I forget what my plans were, but I scratched my plans because I was like, I'm hanging on, I'm white knuckling it here. So I did one of my favorite things. I went for a jog in Central Park and I couldn't finish. I just sat down in the Shakespeare garden and started crying. I don't even really know what I was crying about, but I was not doing okay. So across the street, I lived right kind of off Columbus Avenue, and across Columbus Avenue, there was this little bookstore, and I really I love bookstores. I like to browse in bookstores. It's a thing I like to do. So the whole year that I'd been living there, I would occasionally go into this bookstore. And I would always find my way down to the psychology self-help section, which is interesting because I was in graduate school for international affairs. But I would go down to the psychology self-help section and there was this book. It was On the Way to the Wedding by Linda Leonard.
Mm.
And I was struck by the title. So I'd pull the book off the shelf, I'd open it to any page, and invariably I'd read 2 sentences and start tearing up. And then I'd be like, you know what? I have 600 pages of reading for, my graduate school classes. So I can't buy this book. And I'd put it back on the shelf. And that happened multiple times. I mean, I want to say it happened at least 3 or 4 times.
Mm.
So this terrible day in March that I'm talking about, I went to the bookstore because I like to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I went downstairs, the psychology self-help section, and there was On the Way to the Wedding, and I pulled it off the shelf and I opened it to any page and I started crying and I put it back on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
Then I crossed Columbus Avenue to go back to my apartment, and there was a little like kind of new age gift shop there on at that time that, I kid you not, was called The Hero's Journey. And it was the kind of place that sold like incense and maybe those like Native American dream catchers and some crystals and just that kind of stuff.
We're in LA. We know these shops well.
Okay. Great. That's great. At the back of the store, they had like half a dozen books for sale. It wasn't a bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
One of the books was On the Way to the Wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And even I, at that time, unversed in Jungian thought as I was like, I think that means I have to buy the book.
I see you, spirit. Okay.
Exactly. So I bought the book. I took it back to my apartment. It was a signed copy.
Oh, hello.
Right. So Linda Leonard is a Jungian analyst, and On the Way to the Wedding, still a fabulous book that I recommend all the time, as well as her other books. She's fabulous. Was this really heartfelt, poignant, brilliant, deep, but accessible, warm, just incredible book about her own journey to kind of find love.
Mm-hmm.
And she used fairy tales, and she used clinical vignettes, and she used biography, and she used film. And she introduced me to these ideas of Jung. It's not like I kind of knew who Jung was, but I really didn't know anything about him. But this was my gateway drug to Jung. I was like, wow. And it was, Jung said something like, we don't solve our problems so much as grow larger than them.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like what that book did, I mean, it obviously didn't solve my love life problems. It's not like my boyfriend called me back and said, yeah, let's do this. But I had a different relationship to my suffering after reading that book. I understood it differently, and it made it bearable. It felt like it had meaning. And I swear, by the time I finished that book, I was like, it would be really interesting to do what she does. It would be really interesting to be a Jungian analyst. So I didn't do that right away. I continued to work in that field, but it was really percolating. And a few years later, I did call the New York Jung Institute, and I was like, how does one do this? And it still took me a couple years to really make the commitment, because it's a big commitment, as I'm sure both of you know. I didn't have a mental health background, so I had to go back to graduate school and do that. And so, yeah, that's my origin story.
Wow.
Oh, I love it.
I mean, so many things. I was just thinking as you started, Lisa, how fascinating it is to me that so often, I mean, for many of us, but especially for women, I think there can be the like entry point of a dark night of the soul is the desire for
Yes.
love or heartbreak. And I was thinking about this Marion Woodman quote, and now I'm going to butcher it, but where she talks about, until a woman can fully receive herself, she will unconsciously force all of those around her to reject her, right? And I don't know, there's something in what you were describing about like what Jung said about solving our problems versus like becoming bigger than them, that I feel like there's like on a soul level, that becomes for all of us this point of like, how do I grow bigger than whatever my conceptualization of love has been, that might be a little bit not large enough for who I am meant to become, right?
Oh, Danae, that's so beautiful the way you said that. I think that's exactly right. There's a way that at that time and later too, it's like I wanted some guy to come along
Mm.
and for me not to have to take responsibility for my own life,
Ooh,
right?
that's it right there.
Because the thing is, like I said, I think that dark night of the soul was triggered by this guy,
Mm-hmm.
but really it was about something much deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, if that guy had hung around and we'd gotten married, say, which is something that we had sort of talked about, I mean, what would have happened?
Oof.
You know,
Yes.
I wouldn't have had to confront who I was, what I wanted, what the thing was that wanted to come through me into the world. I wouldn't have had to
Mm.
interrogate any of that
Yep.
if I'd sort of had the happily ever after then.
Mm. Yeah, it would have been an easy kind of way to hide out,
Exactly.
which I think is what I see very often with women who actually do get that, and I'll put in air quotes, happily ever after, right? Happily for now, we'll say that,
Right.
in their like 20s. I mean, so many of these women find their way to my practice,
Yeah.
late 30s, early 40s. And basically, that thing that started for them around that Saturn return that they kind of squashed down
Mm-hmm.
is full force, just thrashing
Oh, that's
and
really
gnawing to
interesting.
get out. And it's changed and it's had iterations in those years, but it's almost, I almost want to say it can almost be damaging at that point because
Mm-hmm.
you've kept it kind of locked and chained and buried for so long that now, I actually did my thesis on trauma as initiation.
That's a
And
great
this
topic.
concept of like, I called it like psychically co-created trauma,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where the psyche, listen, if you're not going to pay attention, it's going to
Right.
do it for you,
Yeah.
right? So you can
Kicking and
either do this
screaming.
the nice way or we can make this real hard, you know? And I feel like that's a
That's
lot of the
great.
women that come to me are at that stage where shit
Right.
is just crumbling and they're like, what do I do? What do I do? And I'm like, well, we need to go back a little bit, don't we?
Yeah, it's kind of like the card of the tower in the tarot. It's like everything just comes crumbling down. And yeah, I guess it did for me. Maybe I was lucky because for me, it like everything crumbled then.
Right. Exactly. Pre-children,
Right.
pre-mortgage, pre
Right.
all of these things, right?
Yes.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
so you have this amazing podcast, right? You link up with two of your coworkers. You all went to school together, right?
Yeah, we were in analytic training together.
Yeah. And you just kind of decide to start nerding out, doing this podcast together. I always say that because
Yeah.
that's what today and I did. We went to Pacifica out here in California. And so we would
Yeah.
have these drives every month up to Santa Barbara and back. And we would just be engrossed, and we decided, like, why are we not recording these?
Oh, that's awesome. I
Yeah.
love
And
it.
so do you feel like doing that? Well, from a timeline perspective, did you write the two books now? Because we're going to get into this kind of second book, The Vital Spark, a little bit more deeply. Did you write those after you were already, the second one you did, but the first one after you were already podcasting?
No, I actually wrote, pretty much half of the motherhood book was my thesis in analytic training.
Yep.
And then I finished analytic training. I was like, I really have to try to write a book on that topic. It was very much like, I would be like, oh shit, this is so much work. Do I really want to do this? And I'd sort of like drop that question in and wait. And then, Psyche was like, you need to do this. So, I graduated from analytic training in 2011 and I didn't sell the book until 2019. So I wasn't even, most of the time I wasn't writing it. I was like trying to get my head around how to write a nonfiction book proposal and how to get an agent and how to develop an author platform and all of that stuff. And the interesting thing is that I was thinking, we started the podcast in 2018 and I definitely was at that time like, okay, I need an author platform. But I didn't think that the podcast was going to do much. I really didn't. I really thought this will be a fun thing to do for me, Deb and Joseph. And then when it took off, like I can definitely say, I don't think I would have gotten a book deal if it hadn't been for the podcast, but I didn't necessarily think it would have that result.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So motherhood happens first.
Mm-hmm.
The second book, The Vital Spark, is out now. This is your newest baby.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I was telling Danae, I was reading it or listening to it, and I had a moment. So I just turned in my manuscript to Sounds
Oh,
True. So all three of us are Sounds True.
oh,
So Danae's book just
fabulous.
came out. My book is out next year. Sounds True ladies
How
here.
awesome.
Uh-huh. And I turned my manuscript in May 13th on my 40th birthday, as it goes.
Oh my gosh.
Uh-huh. And I'm listening to yours, and I said to Danae, I go, oh my God, so much of this book is my book. And I had a
Oh
moment of like
no.
part
Oh
panic,
no. Oh no.
but part like, okay, it's okay. It's in the ether, right? Like this is what's alive right now. And I'm still trying to work through that, but it's what's alive. It's the conversations, right? And I'm sure you could probably see this. So many more people are coming out of the woodworks, just craving spiritual soul depth, connection, and conversation. And it feels more alive right now. And maybe that's just because we're in this world, but
no, I think there's a hunger for it. And
oh yeah.
yes, for sure. And well, first of all, I'm excited to learn about your books. But I mean, when I was turning in my manuscript, I was like, oh, I don't know. I think this is just like kind of, Marion Woodman or Clarissa Pinkola Estes kind of warmed over, I was really worried about that. But then I actually don't think it's like, it's my take on those themes,
right.
and your book will be your take on those themes. And women are hungry for those conversations.
That's right.
So
That's right.
It's a little bit of a demonstration of the collective unconscious, and that I do
yes.
think that there is, the rising of the feminine principle that we're living through. And I think there is a way that we are all sort of on a similar vibration with what we see happening and shifting. And so I was saying the same thing to Vanessa. I was like, no, it's perfect. It's like, this is your perspective on, a conversation that I do think is so alive for all of us.
Right.
It's beautiful.
And besides, in Manhattan, there's the fashion district, which is where all the stores that sell like fabric and everything are on the same blocks. And that's the principle, like you think it's going to hurt you, but it doesn't. It helps you.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. I love that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Lilith.
Yeah.
So I said to Danae, I go, once again, fascinating. So I open your book, and Lilith is kind of like the archetypal principle. She's like at the top, right? And she becomes kind of the North Star. Now, here's what's interesting. I have 12 chapters in my book. In each chapter, I have an archetypal feminine form, and Lilith is one of them.
Oh, wow.
Right? I was like, oh, there's a lot of synchronicities here. But I love how you use her as your North Star.
Yeah.
And I want you to kind of tell our listeners, like, because I know she excites the hell out of me, but what is it about Lilith's energy that kind of, for you, had that like vital spark where you were like, oh, she's the one.
Right. Yeah. I think first of all, she sort of appeared as a gift. I was writing the book kind of quickly. I had a sort of short turnaround time to write it, and so I wasn't like just marinating in this material. In some sense, I've been marinating in this material my whole life, for sure. But in terms of trying to formulate it, it was happening kind of quickly, and I had the ideas, I had the chapters, I had like actually an entire draft was written, and then but I felt like I was missing some focus. And so at that point I went to London with my son, who just graduated from high school. And so we went to the British Museum, and there was this exhibit on called Feminine Power. And it was the most incredible exhibit. I like took pictures of everything. I bought the exhibit book. It was really amazing, but it was basically like images of feminine power, mostly in mythology, from across cultures and across time. And so Lilith was one of the images that was featured, and there was this unbelievable modern sculpture of Lilith, this kind of black form. I think she's made out of metal, climbing on the wall. And it was totally creepy. She's looking over her shoulder at you, life size, up on the wall, and just completely captivating. And so, I'd known about Lilith before, but it was kind of a synchronicity, because I was like, oh, this is the thing that I'm trying to get my hands on. Because what I think I'm trying to do in this book is say, look, there's sort of like two different ways of being in the world. There are these qualities like nurture and warmth and tending that help us get and stay connected to other people, whether it's friends or partners or colleagues or children.
Mm-hmm.
And there are these other qualities like fierceness and authority and anger and uh, cunning that help us get and stay connected to ourselves. And that both of these ways of being in the world are really important. I'm not denigrating the first at all. In fact, that's kind of what motherhood's all about.
Mm-hmm.
But I was really interested in those other qualities and my relationship with them and women's relationship with them. And in some sense, Lilith kind of she kind of is those qualities. It's almost like the Eve Lilith dichotomy is that same dichotomy between, are we being agreeable, putting the needs of others first, kind, generous, all of those lovely things, or are we in this, Lilith's whole story is she didn't want to be subservient to Adam, so she didn't want to lie beneath him when they had sex. And she said to him, the two of us are equal. We're made from the same clay. Like I'm going to stand up and have my rights. And that's when she becomes demonic. And to me, that kind of says something about, human society is absolutely dependent on women's ability to tend and care. And I'm talking on the level of sort of evolution. I mean, human children require so much care for so long.
Whew, yes, they do.
That if women weren't prepared to do that, and again, I'm thinking sort of not, I mean, obviously men can do it too, but at the level of like our evolution as a species, if women couldn't, nurse and tend and carry and all of that stuff that has to happen, we wouldn't make it. Right. So those feminine qualities men can inhabit them too. But those qualities that we think of as typically feminine, of being nurturing, are so important. And at the same time, the averse of those qualities, the opposite of them, are such a threat that they literally are seen as demonic.
Yes.
Demonic is such a big word. And
It
it's
is.
like it elicits such a visceral response. And I love it because I think there's something I've just been over the last few years so struck by how much I can like see clearly the only way some of these systems of oppression or, like some of the societal structures that we, I feel like are starting to see are not serving all of us and, need to change form is if women participate. Like the minute that women are like, nope, we're done. It all falls apart. Like we hold so much power that we're not aware of. Like I look at South Korea and what's happening with that 4B movement of women just like opting out, and the societal structures are sort of falling apart. And I think it's fascinating that like the word demonic and that this is sort of the framework that we're all fed so early about life and relationships and what it is to be a good person. Any sort of stepping outside of those qualities that you're describing is a demonic way of being, It's like, that's big.
So visceral.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Lilith becomes this figure who leads men astray by seducing them, or she's full of fury,
kills babies,
kills and eats babies. Right. So it's like there is not a lot of space for women to be those things. And yet I think we are, we have those potentials within us. And how do we develop a relationship with those parts of ourselves?
Yeah, and I want to read these parts for people listening because I've got it screenshotted here. So disagreeableness, shrewdness, which I love. I want to talk about the word shrew, trickster, desire, sexuality, rage, authority, ruthlessness. Oof.
So that was my list based
Yep.
on probably mostly my own experience and also the experience of women I work with. But I always say, gosh, it's not authoritative. I'm curious if
Sure there are
that
more.
list rings for you guys, or
Yeah.
would you put different things on?
I mean, not only does that list resonate so deeply, I think those qualities are so unbelievably feminine to me. And they
Mm.
are
Yeah,
often like the shadow elements of the feminine
exactly.
that we're so conditioned to shame ourselves for. But I think that
Exactly.
we use for survival or to get our needs met in ways that we're
Totally.
just not, really conditioned to be honest about.
So
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
glad that you said that because I have a quote written down here that speaks to that that I want to read for people listening. From your disagreeableness chapter, which I like hit me like a punch to the gut because you tell this story about this woman who lets this dentist drill on a
Oh,
healthy tooth because she feels bad
Mm.
speaking up and telling him that he's doing the wrong tooth. And I thought to myself, anybody who's taken any kind of like workshop with me, or I have a lot of like codependency workshops I do, knows the story of my ugly tattoo, which I even write in my
oh
book, which is a
no. Oh
similar
no. Oh
version
my
of
gosh.
that, where I
Okay.
don't speak up and I let it happen. And now I have a
Oh.
permanent reminder on my body forever and ever of why we speak up. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But so
That's
this quote
a
I
very
love.
valuable tattoo.
Uh-huh. I try to look at it that way every time I look at it in disgust. I'm like, nope, this is important. So you say, if it goes unchecked, it can lead us to be bitter. Trying so
Mhm.
hard to accommodate others, it often constellates the opposite in us. Outwardly, we may seem pleasant and appeasing, while unconsciously, we act out the role of petty tyrant,
Mm.
imposing ourselves on those around us and demanding in passive aggressive maneuvers that others give us what we have denied ourselves.
Mhm.
Oof.
And I was
Yep.
like, here it is.
Yep.
Big
I
breath.
think I think that can certainly happen.
Mm. And I think that's a lot of the work that I do so often personally, my own work,
Yeah.
and also with so many of my female clients is exactly what you were saying, Danae. It's like with so much grace, holding ourselves and understanding that we have learned how to maneuver through the world in a way that we will get our needs met, hopefully, right, in
Mhm.
some form or capacity. But we have to do it strategically because we have been so forcefully cut off from that list that we read,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Which does embolden and allow us to get our needs met, right, in a
Right.
very clear and direct kind of way. And that has been looked at as demonic. I mean, listen, we could go back to the witch trials. We were literally burned at the
Yeah.
stake for being those ways, right?
Hundreds of
Uh-huh.
us, right?
Uh-huh. Right.
Um, Danae, I just want to go back and pick up on something you just said because I think it's worth lifting up, especially for your audiences. You
Mm.
know, this is absolutely a discussion of the quality, the shadowy feminine,
Mhm.
right? Both on a collective level, like Lilith is an image of sort of female shadow,
Mm.
but even on a personal level, like I don't think that every one of those qualities would be in every woman's shadow, but for many of us, at least a couple are probably in the shadow for us.
Mm.
So I didn't use that language very often in the book, partly because that's the shadow is now like a whole thing in the culture, and
Mm.
it's like, well, if you can avoid using jargon,
Mm.
but it's helpful to kind of link it into that concept too. I think especially if you have some familiarity with depth psychology. So yeah, it's definitely about shadow, and it and Vanessa, to your point, I mean, what happens when we don't acknowledge shadow? It can kind of eat us up from the inside.
Mhm. Mm.
Yeah, I'm having a lot of thoughts. um,
So what I was picking up on before was this concept of shrew, and I want to talk about shrewdness a little bit,
Hmm.
because I do think so. In my book, I talk about some of the words that have been kind of
Ah,
usurped by patriarchy,
oh wow,
and shrew is one of them.
great.
Gossip, right, is another one. Like
Mm.
taking the original meaning, turning it around, and making it the opposite, and
Oh
really
yeah,
using it
yeah.
against women, right, as a way to control. And I
Oh
think
wow.
shrew and shrewdness are a great example of how something that actually is very powerful and can be a life force energy, really, is then taken and turned around. So can you speak a little bit about how you use shrewdness? Because I'm betting the vast majority of people even hearing us use these words are having that like ick reaction, because
Yeah.
it's the only way we know to think of the word shrew and shrewdness, right?
Right. So I, first of all, I think it's so interesting talking about the ick reaction, because I've had a number of people, like, I've had a lot of really good response to the book, but I've had a certain number of people like, oh, I wanted my book group to read about it, but then I told them about it. They were like, no, we don't want to read about that. Or like, a couple of times I've presented and people were like, well, I never want to encourage my daughter to be, to be a trickster. And I was like,
Yes.
really? Because
Like, why?
a trickster has kind of saved my life. So I hope my daughter knows how to be a trickster. So yeah, so the ick feeling. So I'm just going to read just a quick paragraph, if that's okay. Shrewdness is the ability to see things as they are, not as we wish they were or think they should be. The dictionary tells us that shrewd means having or showing sharp powers of judgment, astute. The term was taken from the small rodent, the shrew, which has a long pointed snout and tiny eyes. It originally meant evil in nature or character. To this day, the word shrew has two meanings. It refers to the small mammal, but it also means a bad-tempered or aggressively assertive woman. This one word then reveals a deep cultural truth. Women with sharp powers of judgment are considered bad-tempered or aggressively assertive. To avoid being a shrew, a woman mustn't be too shrewd. Don't see what there is to know, remain innocent and naive. Yet when we can't access our shrewdness, we risk being unable to protect ourselves.
I remember what I was going to say.
I knew it
always
was sparking
comes
in
back
you.
eventually. I'm like, always like, since I had a baby, I have these moments where it's like, my mind just went blank. And then it comes back.
I don't think it ever comes back.
I mean, it usually comes back eventually. Anyway, what I was thinking was how many of these qualities on the list that aren't necessarily what we would like reflexively think of as feminine, we tend to associate societally with more masculine qualities. Even shrewd, like he's a shrewd businessman, right? But there's a very different connotation in the way that we're describing it in conjunction with women, which I think is fascinating, right? Like, and it's assertive women is sort of like a problem, or
we're a bitch, right? If we're assertive and he's like assertive, there's a different meaning.
I think that's fascinating to me.
It is.
And the ways that we're shamed, even like if you think about the sensuality, and I can't remember exactly.
Desire.
Did you say desire? Is one of the qualities, but I think that that's so often we're conditioned to think of as the masculine is the driver of sensuality, when that's not actually true. It is normally like the feminine that, like, without the conditioning or the shaming that is so early conditioned into us culturally, it is the feminine, like historically it would be like the woman that would be the driver of the manifestation of life force, right? So I just think what you're saying is so fascinating.
Well, it seems to me, when you were talking, one of the things that came up for me is like, it's almost like, just generally, I'm speaking sort of like at a population level. I'm not saying this is true of each and every woman, but like our ability. So if we think about these two kind of sets of qualities, one set is more about fostering relationship, and the other is more about fostering kind of assertiveness and personal empowerment. It's almost like women have a more unambivalent relationship to the nurturance qualities, and a harder time maybe with the assertiveness qualities. And with men, it might be a little bit flipped. Like, again, I know men who definitely are kind of more feminine in the way that I'm talking about here. But in general, like on a kind of population wide thing, most men feel more comfortable like being shrewd or being assertive, and it's maybe a little bit harder to sort of like sink into that nurturing, tending place. So but yeah, there is like a feminine version of these traits, and we are often shamed for showing them. And it feels, I don't know about for you, but to me it feels difficult. Like it's still hard for me to be angry at someone. It feels so uncomfortable. I
Mhm.
get angry a lot, but then I'm always like, I'm like guilty, and I'm like, am I
Mm.
allowed to be angry? Did I
Mm.
overreact? Like,
Mhm.
men mostly don't do that.
No,
Yeah.
the questioning of the self.
Right.
And I
Hmm.
also find too, at least a lot of the women that I've spoken to, because I was in corporate for similar to you, had a whole other kind of life
Hmm.
before this life, right? And I have never had a hard time being assertive, shrewd, angry, and
Hmm.
expressing it in my
Okay.
business self.
Got it.
Like when I was in advertising and a more corporate kind of environment, like I was a producer, I had to be assertive and direct, and I
Okay.
had no problem accessing that. I very rarely felt bad about those things.
Hmm.
But then I would literally go home the same day to my ex-partner and feel bad about those same qualities, right? So it is interesting how even within one woman, there can be this,
Interesting. That
when
is
there's
really interesting.
vulnerability and intimacy involved, suddenly they become almost impossible to access. But when I don't have that intimacy, they're like readily available.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I don't know. I'm still
Yeah, no,
unpacking
that's
that
very,
one.
yeah, no, that's very interesting. That helps me think about these things because I mean, I think this is in some ways it's like to go back to like this is kind of the conversation that we're all having.
Mhm.
Like I think a lot of stuff that I write in here is stuff that we all kind of know.
Mm.
Hmm.
But to make it all make sense, I still don't think it all makes sense to me somehow, But it does just seem like a struggle that many of us have
Mhm. Well, it's
to
ever
figure out.
unfolding. I
Yeah.
think that maybe is why it doesn't, because as you're saying that, I'm like, yeah, I'm still working to have it make sense, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
to your point, like we're all seeing clients. I mean, we're having these conversations all the time. And I feel like every day there's a new kind of layer to the onion that's kind of being peeled. And
Mm-hmm.
so each time, right, I'm understanding something in a little bit of a different way or a different light, or I'm seeing it slightly different, and it adds to that understanding. But do we ever really understand it? I mean, or is this just the lifelong
Mm-hmm.
onion, you know?
Yeah. And that to me
Yeah.
is like that
That's
circular space of the feminine again,
yeah.
but also
Yes.
that like there's something beautiful in the contemplation and
Mhm.
that what I love about what you're describing in Lilith is that she is questioning and she is challenging,
Mhm.
and there's a box that I'm supposed to be in, and this is the
Mhm.
way that we're supposed to make love, and what else could be true? And this feels not true for me. I think there's so many things in those qualities you're describing that I have a lot of lone wolf energy. And so while I
Mm.
think I was able for most of my life to put myself in a cultural box of like, I'm supposed to want to connect and, be really close to people. And that is just not the truth of how I feel. And as I've gotten older, I'm like, no, I'm actually okay with very little social interaction always. And I think there's a self acceptance in that I
Mm.
didn't have enough of the ego strength and sense of self when I was younger to
Mhm.
own that.
Right.
But
Right.
I think that like even you presenting them in this way gives you space for being in that contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
I love that.
really good point today, because that it is. It's like there are a lot of women, that are not going to and never really feel like they can lean into some of those more, again, air quote, feminine qualities, right? Like
Right.
I'm not nurturing. I don't have any of those qualities. And I do think living in this societal structure, they're also shamed, right? They also feel a
Mm-hmm.
sense of shame. Like, what's wrong with me? Why don't I feel, let's say, the call to motherhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Danae and I have talked multiple times over the years on our podcast. I never wanted to have children ever.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided, very oddly, the way that I decided to do it. And I still struggle with it, because it is a
Mm-hmm.
constant battle between, I don't know that I embody all those qualities, and I don't really feel comfortable in those qualities all the time. But I think my long-winded point is that's okay too. Right.
Yeah. Well, and that's why a kind of Jungian take on these things is really helpful, right? Because it's a
Mm.
kind of constant circumambulation.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't like, okay, we're going to get to the answer or
Yep.
the way to understand this, but we can just keep on walking around it and looking at it, And whenever I think of circumambulation, I always think of like a piece of sculpture,
Mm.
which I love sculpture because you walk around it and you see something like slightly different
Mm-hmm.
from every angle, and it's like an experience. It's not one flat thing that you can just know and then you can fold it up and put it in your pocket.
Mm.
But it's something that you just keep on experiencing. So
Mm.
There's
I love
something
that.
so grounding in the way that you speak to things. It's really lovely.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
Well, we want to make sure that we're, cognizant of your time, but we do have a lightning round of questions
Okay.
that we ask all of our guests. So,
All right. So the first question is, who have been your greatest teachers, mentors, people that have impacted your path up to this point?
Yeah.
Whether they're people
Yeah.
you know or just you've really loved their work.
Right. Well, actually, Linda Leonard.
mhm.
So, she really did set me on my path. And I actually, so that was back in the 1990s. That was like before email and
The
internet.
1900s.
I know.
I was just talking about this with somebody the other day. You were born in the 1900s? I'm like, oh God.
So I wrote her a letter.
I love that.
And never didn't hear back or anything. But then I eventually started analytic training, and she actually came to teach. And so I
Wow.
got to meet her in person, and that was really delightful. And then when I started, and then she actually, I kind of knew her in my training institute because she was one of the analysts there. And then when I started working on the book, I contacted her, and she blurbed my book, and she was just really helpful. So I often see her we're both in the Interregional Society of Union Analysts. And so, just kind of had, coffee with her out in, this past April, just reconnecting with her. So I should say also that if you read Linda's books, like On the Way to the Wedding, or The Wounded Woman is another really important book that she wrote, and then you pick up either Motherhood or The Vital Spark, you'll be like, because she was my muse in a way. I
Yeah.
basically copied her format, right? Because so she'll have a chapter on a topic, and then she kind of hangs it on a fairy tale with clinical examples, personal stories, maybe a film. And I absolutely copied that, and I don't try to pretend otherwise. So I'm very, very grateful to her, and she's really, it's hard to kind of quantify how much she's impacted me. So.
I wonder if Pincola Estes was informed by her work as well, because that's her structure. And then I would say I stole the structure from Pincola Estes. So it's like the chain of kind of women in this world, right? Who have been inspired by the person ahead of them and the person ahead of them and the person ahead of them. Because the structure is so powerful.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, because it's all story based, right? That's what made reading her books a pleasure, in addition to like really getting your neurons firing.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why I wanted to use that structure. Because I do, like, when I was writing this book, I was like, I want it to be fun to read this book.
Yes.
Like, I don't want it to be like, oh, it's really good, but it's kind of a slog. I want it to be like, God, I can't wait to sit down with my glass of wine and read that book, And I think when you tell a lot of stories, whether it's personal stories or fairy tales or clinical vignettes or, a dream, it's lively. So anyway, but it is, there is we are standing on the shoulders of these great women who went before us.
That's right. Okay, so the second question is around this concept of flow, right? So that thing where everything becomes aligned and suddenly you blink your eyes, an entire day has gone by. What is that for you? What is flow?
You mean like what brings that on for me? I mean, I love writing, actually. I really love writing. And I don't usually do it for a whole day. That might drive me bonkers. but I do really, even when it's hard, I like find it almost like physically satisfying. Like when I've just been writing and it's gone well and I finish, it's just like there's just a good physical feeling in my body. So I really love writing.
I like that as an indicator for people listening, like flow, having a good, the physical response in your body, that like you feel good in your body, I think is a great indicator that you're onto something. Yeah.
Beautiful. And Lisa, what breaks your heart?
Oh God, what breaks my heart? Oh, that's a good question. There's different ways I can answer it. Boy, there are so many things that I could say. But maybe I'll say something about maybe this is a little cerebral, but the way that ideology can tear apart relationships with those that we're closest to. Maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. That's
That was
powerful.
heartbreaking. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then the final question is, what is your favorite food?
Oh my God.
We'll
That's
end it
such
on
a
the lighter note.
that is such a fun question. I
It
love
tells
that
us a lot
question.
about people, let me tell you.
um wow. I mean, like just generally as a category, well, I love fruit and I love cheese and I love pizza and I love Mexican food and I love Indian food and
Do you have
You're
any tourists
Vanessa's
in your
type of
chart?
woman. You love food. That's
I
like
do.
enough said.
And I love
So
and I love
good.
cake and cookies, even though
Oh, you're my kind of
Now you're
woman.
her girl.
I know. I love it.
Now we're talking.
Oh, beautiful. Well, I am going to get on the way to the wedding. Like right now, I'm going to go see if I can order it. And I'm so excited now to read A Vital Spark. And I'm just so honored to meet you, Lisa. Thank you so much for doing this. I have therapy after this. My therapist is a Jungian analyst, so she's going to be geeking
awesome.
out that I got to meet you. But thank you.
That's great.
Just
All right.
really, really enjoyed this time with you.
Thank you guys so much for having me on. It was
Yeah.
so fun.
Thank you,
It was
Lisa.
really
So
fun.
for everybody listening, we will obviously hyperlink everything for the Vital Spark and then tell everybody kind of how they can find you, all the pods, all the links, all the things.
Sure. Well, the podcast is This Jungian Life and the website is thisjungianlife.com, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And we have a book coming out in November on dream interpretation.
So excited. I'm reading it now.
And also let's see. Oh, my author site is lisamarchiano.com, and you can sign up for my mailing list because I run women's retreats once or twice a year. And I also have a women's fairy tale group that's linked from there. It's spinningstraw.com. Every month we read a fairy tale together and work through it using prompts, and it's a lot of fun.
Love that.
I love that.
Yeah,
That
it's
is
really
really
cool.
You might have 2 new people signing
I
up.
know. I'm like, oh, fascinating.
Amazing.
Great.
Thank you so
Thank you
much,
so
Lisa.
much.
Thanks.